accepted the challenge to discuss her professor's book. So, and then on my right, extreme right, which is unfair. Yeah, I was going to qualify that. Extreme right is Professor Harry Konstantinidis, who is an assistant professor in the Department of Economics. And on my left is, of course, Professor Chun, who is the author of the book. I think the way we agreed to do that is the three of us will start. So we will discuss the book through the lens of our own experiences and work. And then Christian is going to, I guess, bring everything together and then discuss his experience in, conceptualizing and writing the book. And then we're going to open it up to questions from the audience. Right? Sounds okay. So we're going to start with the economics guy.
Oh, it's me. Okay.
Yeah.
All right. So thank you for inviting me, first of all, and thank you for giving me the opportunity to actually read the book before it is released. And since I play the economist in the room, I'm going to talk a little bit about how the book connects with economics and also connects with a certain tradition in economics, the political economic tradition out of UMass Boston and other places that develop this class analytic framework for rethinking how we think about capitalism. First of all, let me praise the book. I think you should all read it. I found it very useful. I found it that it spoke to so many different things that we encounter in the classroom, that we encounter in our own work as researchers, and also that speaks to things that we grapple with on a daily basis. Those of us who care about positive social change, progressive social change, radical social change, transformative social change. So regarding the economic part, first of all, Christian, as he notes in the book, economics has become increasingly a monoculture, and economics is increasingly dominated by two discourses, a neoliberal and a Keynesian discourse, both of which, despite their differences, aim to naturalize capitalism and aim to make capitalism appear to be eternal. And that's something that we, at least at the UMass Boston Economics Department, struggle with, because I don't know if people are aware with that, but we're a slightly unusual department. We're extraordinary in that we don't just think about the dominant discourses of capitalism, but we bring in other perspectives as well. We think about feminist critiques of capitalism, we think about ecological critiques of capitalism, and I want to say primarily, we think about the Marxian critiques of capitalism. And John Millman is right here, who teaches the Marxian economics class. We also, and that's something that Christian also talks about in the book, we also teach classes that are not taught in many other places. We teach the history of economic thought, we teach political economy, and we invite our students to think critically about capitalism. And we invite our students to think about the relationship between theory and the making of capitalism, right? We invite our students to think about the role of economic theories in making economics, in enacting the economy, in shaping the practices that we see on a daily basis. So for me personally, teaching at UMass and also teaching Marx at UMass Boston, you can see that I love the challenge of it, but it's still a challenge because we encounter students who come into the classroom carrying all these common sense beliefs that Christian talks about in the book. Right? People come into the classroom and they associate capitalism with freedom, they associate capitalism with democracy, they associate capitalism with opportunity, they associate capital with social mobility. In similar ways as the people that whose interviews Christian analyzes in his book. Right? So our students have fantasies about capitalism. They believe that they can move upwards through the capitalist system. But at the same time, and I think this is crucial here, our students, and that's the pleasure of teaching at UMass Boston, also have the other part of the equation that Christian is talking about. They have a lot of good sense, right? Because, again, teaching at UMass Boston, you don't really have to try very hard to explain to students exploitation. You don't have to, you have to try very hard, don't get me wrong about this. You have to try really, really hard to tell them what exploitation looks like. But their lived experiences allow them to think about exploitation in a much more immediate way than it would if they were somewhere else, right? And that's something that makes this challenge slightly easier for us when we try to enact positive, progressive, transformative social change. Now, as Christian talks about in the book, common sense and good sense are in attention with one another, right? And you know, we need to engage the common sense of people about capitalism, but we also need to pull out the good sense that people have about capitalism. And the book does an excellent work in terms of like talking about economic representations and also talking about the economic representations of the everyday economist, right? And I haven't quite explained what the book is about. Perhaps somebody will do that later. But what the book does is that it analyzes 312 interviews from participants in Steve Lambert's art installation called Capitalism Works for Me, where people are asked to vote whether capitalism works for them or not, right? So people vote true or false, and if I understand correctly, Christian got access to the interviews and through a very meticulous analysis managed to pull out the themes and managed to identify the common sense beliefs that people have about capitalism, but also the good sense beliefs that you can find in these interviews, the themes that allow for progressive and critical thinking of capitalism. Regarding the novelty of the book, and first of all, let me say that this is a book that nicely fits in with the political economy tradition and with a class analytic framework, and it also takes this one step further because it doesn't talk about economic representations in art, it doesn't talk about economic representations in advertising, it talks about the ways that people think about the economy, everyday people think about the economy, and the way that by doing that, people enact the economy and people shape the economy. Right? And I think this is a very interesting project, and I also think it's politically significant, and particularly politically significant in the present conjuncture that we are faced with. Right? So over the last few months, you see things like the last presidential election in the US, or you see Brexit, or you see all these developments, and you see a significant part of the political spectrum say, oh, people are stupid, people are idiots, people are this, people are that, right? If people knew, they wouldn't have done it, right? And I think that Christian's project, theoretical but also political, and I hope I'm not misrepresenting what you're doing here, is in some way to try to pull out the good sense out of this, to try to identify the common sense and to work with the common sense beliefs of people and to say, let's understand why people hold these common sense beliefs. Let's understand why people think about democracy, think about capitalism and think about democracy. Let's understand why people identify capitalism with freedom, and let's try to challenge this and let's try to create counter-hegemonic common sense beliefs, new ways of understanding the world, right? And let me just wrap up with two examples here, right? As you will see in the book, people identify commonly capitalism with freedom and capitalism with democracy, right? And those of us who may believe that we should do better than capitalism can challenge both of these common sense beliefs using both the Gramscian framework, but also using this class analytic framework, this Marxian class analytic framework, right? So people identify capitalism with freedom. Well, what's the freedom in having to sell your capacity to perform labor if you want to stay alive, right? Is it freedom to be able to sleep under the bridge at night if you're unwilling to participate in a capitalist system that expects you to sell your labor power as a commodity, right? So we can immediately do a very clear critique of capitalism on its own terms. The second thing about democracy, right? We identify commonly, people identify commonly capitalism with democracy, right? And then people forget that for most of our time, we spend our lives working in firms, right? maybe not all of us, right? We work in, some of us work in universities, but like, if you think about capitalism, if you think about capitalist, workers in capitalism, wage workers, people work in firms. There's no democracy in firms. People do not have a say in how their labor processes run. And people do not have a say in how the major decisions are taken in enterprises. They don't have a say in how their surplus, the value that they add beyond what is necessary for their own subsistence and which they get back in wages. People don't have a say in how this is distributed. People, workers in capitalist firms don't decide whether the surplus of the firm is going to be spent to buy back the stock of the firm, whether it's going to be paid for bonuses for CEOs, whether it's going to go for advertising. And there, if we want to challenge capitalism, we can use again this common sense belief in order to pull out and to tease out the good sense, right? If capitalism is about democracy, well, does it really work? I'll leave it at that because I'm sure I've gone way past the allotted time that I was given. But let me just say again, it was a pleasure to read the book, and I would want to highly recommend it.
Well, I'll follow that up, I guess. So the way that I approach this book is very differently because I've taken one econ class in my entire life. But from the moment I started reading this book, it felt very familiar to me. And part of the reason for that was because of the one econ class I took, where we started with reading the Communist Manifesto after we all had to confess what our economic leanings were, and everybody's saying conservative, and I was like, not liberal at all. Definitely, I'm not. And as we're reading the Communist Manifesto, and everybody's saying it's just so impractical, it makes no sense, and it's just, it's just how dictatorships will form, blah, blah. And I was reading and thinking, this doesn't really sound that bad to me. And Christian had a very similar experience in his undergraduate, so that was familiar to me. And then just in reading the interviews that he analyzed, many of the phrases were phrases that I've heard my entire life, whether from my dad who loves to watch Fox News, or many of my friends that I went to college with, because when I would bring up socialism or anything, any challenge to capitalism, they would just say, oh, you humanities, you're so cute, that's sweet, it's very sweet. And so, in a lot of ways, this was really exciting to read because it kind of gave me fodder to continue to challenge. I was like, oh, this is what I can say, this is how I can retaliate. But I think it's really interesting because it's more complicated than just criticizing capitalism or, trying to push a communist agenda, if you will. Because, like Harry was talking about, it brings in these ideas of common sense versus good sense. And as I was reading this, I kept wondering, how is it possible that these two things can exist at the same time? Because even though my dad, who didn't have a college education, was a New York City firefighter, always had to work a second job, he very strongly believes in capitalism and believes it's the only solution and believes in a lot of things that Bill O'Reilly says. He still had the good sense to not vote for Trump or to sort of push back against a lot of Republican platforms that he recognized as not actually being in his best interest. And so, because one of my main interests in linguistics is the way that language forms somebody's identity, I kept asking myself, okay, so how is it possible that somebody's identity can have both of these things existing at once? Christian references post-structuralist theories in here, and I think that idea of subjectivity, where there's multiple identities that coexist and often in conflict with one another, there's this tension and they're always pushing back against each other. To me, that kept coming up again and again, where I was saying, okay, this is how it happens. And I think it's really important to recognize that, because part of the art of persuasion is understanding where people come from and how those ideologies have been shaped. And so for me, what was really powerful when I went to my undergraduate program is that I had great professors who recognized my background and recognized why I was thinking the things that I was thinking, and in acknowledging that, they also said, that's okay to think that, here's some new ways of thinking about it. And for me, that just completely opened up my world. And so one of the things I love about this book is that it's very caring. It's, you know, it's not going through these interviews and saying, oh, these idiots who thought these things, and how could they ever think that? This is ridiculous. You know, it takes the time to really engage with these ideas and where they come from, and in some ways justify the reasons for thinking these ways, because I think that they are justifiable reasons when you look at the way that our society has shaped us and structured the way that we think. So there's, I don't even want to say that there's criticism of the common sense, it's just engagement and saying, okay, well, here's maybe the good sense in this common sense and how we can then capitalize on that good sense as a way of persuading these people to perhaps think differently, or at least even just expose themselves to different ways of thinking. So that's just kind of my approach to it. So.
Thank you. It's my turn. So when Christian actually sent me the manuscript, I thought to myself, damn it, this is the book I wish I had written. So, in a sense, he put the bar very high now for anybody who is dealing with this topic in applied linguistics, you know, to follow up on this kind of work. I'm saying that because in applied linguistics, I mean, there has been tremendous progress in the direction of finally asking those important questions about power and the workings of power, dominance, hierarchies, to pose political questions about how language works in society, how politics shape language, and vice versa. I mean, all the work that exists in discourse, in particular critical discourse analysis, addresses exactly these important questions that were for many years absent, because linguistics and applied linguistics was supposed to be a field that only deals with language, as if language, you know, functions in a vacuum with people, with ideal speakers, listeners, right? In an ideal speech community where, you know, they're not affected by anything else. We're just talking about languages, communication. So Christian, I think, does exactly that. He does not succumb in this discourse-centered analysis, which is also something that we see a lot in the work of applied linguists. So suddenly everything is discursive, right? Everything is language. But he brings all the issues home in his book, because he grounds his discussion on language and discourse and how they function in capitalism through the lens of those everyday economists by talking about minimum wage, unemployment, the economy. I have made a note about this. So he's really talking about very specific things. He makes the material connection, and this connection is very, at least in our field, not in your field or in political science, is usually absent because we remain in the discursive language level. So I think this is one of the main contributions of the book, at least for the field of applied linguistics. So he does feel that very important gap. The second thing, the book has a Gramscian theoretical framework as well, among other things, other theoretical perspectives. And this is important because the way Gramsci thinks about intellectuals, for example, is an important discussion that in a way explains Christian's choice to analyze all those interviews where people talk about capitalism and if it works for them. I'm going to make parentheses here. So the installation says capitalism works for me. So Christian does something tricky here, I think, in his book. So the assumption is that people know what capitalism is. So when you answer the question, capitalism works for me, yes or no, the assumption is that you know what capitalism is. But this really prompts you to answer Christian's question. What is capitalism in your mind, right? So I close the parenthesis. So going back to Gramsci. So Gramsci says, talking about intellectual, he says everybody, every human being is an intellectual because everybody has the ability to think, right? Everybody has a worldview. Everybody has an opinion about the world around them. So what essentially differentiates intellectuals from non-intellectuals is the division of labor. because some people are actually paid to think and express their worldview, like, for example, what we do in the academy, right? But I think what Christian, again, is doing in his book is exactly embracing this idea that everybody's an intellectual because everybody has a worldview. And going back to what Laura said, these are not stupid people, right, who don't know what's happening to them. Actually, I think the data is revealing, it's amazing, you know, all the layered identities and politics that, you know, coexist in there. Even the differences between how people identify themselves when they start talking and then what they really say, so what the discourse says about them. So I think that's another important aspect. I also like, I don't know, I think it's the beginning of your third chapter, you say capitalism loves to talk about itself. And I'm thinking, and we love critiquing it until we don't have to deal with it anymore. So that means that whatever we say about capitalism and whatever discourses we articulate, these have to also be accompanied by some type of praxis, political action, activism. They need also a platform, specific platform to be expressed and carried over. I mean, we need to have a platform to carry the politics. I personally think it's very important. Another point I want to make also is the discourses in plural, so discourses of capitalism. There's often this misconception that there's this giant hegemonic capitalist discourse that exists out there. It's crushing us, and then on the other side there are all these other, let's call them subjugated discourses, that they kind of sit across from capitalist discourses, as if there's, you know, there are two poles. And I think another important achievement of Christian's book is exactly that it breaks this misconception. First of all, there's not such a, you know, a huge hegemonic discourse that is so solid and so impenetrable as capitalism. And I think I have his quote somewhere. Say something interesting, but I'm lost in my notes here. But anyway, you make exactly the case that these discourses are porous, essentially, and they are penetrable. And also, on the other side of the fence, it's not just one discourse. There are many layered discourses that come with different kinds of identities, agencies also. Agency is also very important. So this idea of discourses in the plural, I think is very important. Moving forward, I also like the way Christian weaves his personal lived experiences through his studies, his activism. I think it's very important for those of us who teach in the academy to also walk the talk and to not be this kind of ivory tower academics. We love to talk about capitalism, but we never want to get our hands dirty or be part of a crowd that demonstrates or, you know, actually be out in the street. I think we belong to both places, and if we had to belong somewhere, it had to be on the streets and not up here. So, sorry, being mindful of time. Yeah, chapter 3 is one of my favorite chapters, personally, because this is where Christian grounds discourse to real life and material relations. I think he does this in a Marxist framework. I think it's important to note that Christian reads Marx and understands Marx. So he's not one of those imposter Marxists that we very often find in the academy. So I particularly like chapter 3 because this is where you bring Bakhtin. Mikhail Bakhtin is one of my favorites in this whole idea of the carnival. And I particularly like this parallel that you make between the carnival and the Occupy movement, and, you know, as a public space, a space where people can enact different identities and discourses, reconfigure social relations, call into question, you know, what is happening. So this is a chapter that particularly resonated with the work I also do. And finally, I won't say chapter 7, the idea of, pedagogy, how pedagogy plays into all that. I hope this is going to be your next book, because I was left wanting to read more about it. And so, in closing, I think it's a very important book for our discipline, applied linguistics, but a very important book generally, and it also, I think, opens the path for such work, more work like that to be produced and legitimized, because it's also very difficult to publish work that is critical. Publishers do not trust you, with critical work. They prefer to publish something that's it's more mainstream. It's not what's the word I'm looking for? Anyway, I can't find it. So
innocuous.
Yeah, we're gonna go around. No, so it takes courage, to articulate this kind of work. And I was thinking, it's not a coincidence that there are 2 Greeks in the panel talking about everyday economists, because in Greece since 2008, everybody became an everyday economist, because suddenly this economic discourse that was absolutely unknown until then, penetrated everything, our daily existence. And in my own work, I looked into how this happens. I used Krugman's term, economies. He calls it economies. It's like parentheses, motherese, economies. So I think it's interesting that both of us are on that panel to talk about everyday economists. And with that, I want to thank you for, the work you did. I think it's amazing, and it's like I said, it opens the path for more similar work to be produced.
Okay, well, thank you, Panagiota, Laura, and Harry. Let's just quickly, I know the light's going to be in your eyes, so I'm just going to be a few minutes or so. How do I put this back on? I had so much trouble just before. you hit one switch. You hit one button.
Yeah, I know. I just paused the light. Yeah, that's what I hit shut down. I was just like, no.
There you go. There you go. We're not the most tech savvy of faculty. Anyway, so you can see here is the cover of the book, and it features, Harry had mentioned this, it features the artwork by the artist Steve Lambert. So I'm just going to give a quick background on that. Some of you have heard it before, but Steve Lambert had developed this around 2010, 2011, I believe, and he took it literally on the road. So he took it to places such as here, Boston, New York, London, Cedar Rapids, Iowa. He did take it to Los Angeles, but unfortunately, the wisdom of the city forbade him to show it on the street, so it was stuck in some art gallery. Go figure, in Los Angeles, right? But so, as Panagiota was talking about, yes, a passerby would vote on it, and then Steve and his crew would interview willing participants to ask them what they thought. Just 2 quick charts I wanted to just show here. This is from, both charts are from the economist David Ruccio, who is a professor of economics at the University of Notre Dame. And here, this is quite stark here, as you can see. This is probably not surprising to many in the room. The actual productivity, the dotted line, of course, has risen enormously in the last 35 years or so. And yet wages, real wages per hour in manufacturing has stagnated. So, you know, this idea that there was that discourse in the 1970s and 80s that somehow the Japanese workers were so much harder working than Americans. American workers were just lazy and so forth. You know, the statistics just belie that fact. And the other quick chart I just wanted to show here was also taken from David Ricciot's blog, The Tale of Two Countries. As you can see, the green line is the bottom 50% of wage earners here in the country, and as you see, the percentage of the pay has slowly dropped, whereas the top 1% has increased. So I just wanted to take a few minutes and just kind of talk about quickly the background of the book of this and how it evolved. Harry and Panagiota touched upon it, and then we'll open up for questions. But as Panagiota referred to the last chapter, you know, the whole aim of the book was really to think about ways in which, through what has been called public pedagogy, but how do we actually engage with people's ideas about discourses? Because survey after survey, according to institutes like the Pew Research Center, have shown that the majority of Americans actually do not favor capitalism. So if in fact the majority of our country does not favor capitalism, why is capitalism still going on, right? And so what are some of the strategies that we can develop where we get people to actually not only start questioning it explicitly, but start enacting ways in which they can transform their own workplaces. Harry would know the work, the economists of the work of the economists, Gibbs and Graham. They've carefully documented across many parts of the world. There's actually, including here, there are many communities in which non-capitalist economies are already at work. And so places like Cleveland, for example, has seen, you know, post-industrial collapse. They've had many workplaces which are called co-ops. They're organized around non-capitalist means of production and distribution. And so, you know, what are the ways in which we can start to get that to become more of a kind of a force throughout our economy? And so, yeah, just wrapping it up in terms of what I was trying to do with the book was to introduce to a larger audience this idea of the multiple ways in which people conceptualize this capitalism, but also to find out the ways going forward to contest those different discourses.
Thank you. Okay, so questions, discussion, statements. I know you haven't read the book yet, but yeah, Mike.
Just a quick question. So we say everyone's intellectual. I like that point that you made. Was it Gramsci, right?
Gramsci, yeah.
We say everyone, but then when someone mentions Fox News, we all laugh out the side of our mouths. How do we reconcile that?
Say that again.
You mean people who are interviewed by Fox News, or the Fox News casters?
No. So how do we take a stance where we say that everyone is intellectual and everyone can participate in this conversation, while simultaneously casting aspersions on the other side?
Sure.
Well.
Yeah, that's a great question. And yeah, I mean, you know, aside from that kind of proverbial, the kind of prototypical viewer of Fox News, you know, in my own experience, and Panagiota knows this because she's seen my Facebook posts, I like to engage conversations with taxi drivers. And some of the most interesting conversations I've had are with taxi drivers. Because partly is because they're somewhat of a kind of also amateur anthropologists, as it were, because they get into conversations with many of their passengers. And it's interesting to hear, you know, their takes on things. So, you know, for example, a couple of months ago when I came back from a trip, had two separate taxi drivers, both of whom were immigrants. One was, his father is Jewish and his mother's Muslim, and he voted for Trump, okay? And yet, on the other hand, I had just recently another taxi driver. He was originally from the Middle East, but lived in Boston for 60 years, did his service with the U.S. Army proudly, and hates Trump. And so it's interesting how, too, you might think, like, okay, one person whose mother is Muslim, you think by default that hates Trump, and the other person who's... But, so how is it that they came at different kind of conclusions around that? You know, this idea about, you know, that people, you know, the large populace or, you know, Rust Belt, throughout the Rust Belt, people are just idiots. I'll just do a quick thing, and Laura knows, because I showed the video in the last day of the class, which is that there was an interview done by the Young Turks with this young man named Nick Smith, who is making $3.25 an hour at the Waffle House chain restaurant. Comes from a long line of coal miners. His family, you know, coal mining for over 100 years. Of course, there are no coal mining jobs. He's not working in the coal mines. And so they started talking to him, and he self-identified as a redneck, you know, hillbilly, white trash, self-identified. And you'd start to think he'd be one of those prototypical Fox viewers. Yet, what he has to say about capitalism, the fight for $15 an hour, racism and so forth, was probably as smart, if not smarter, than any other academic I've heard talk about it. So there you go. I think it's just that kind of almost what's been called poverty porn, representation in the media of the so-called dumb populace to kind of keep on convincing us that most of us are dumb, which we're not.
If I could also just comment on that. This is something that I'm always struggling with, because I find like the deeper that I go into academia, like the farther away I get from my upbringing as a working class, you know, daughter of a firefighter. And I always try to be mindful. One of the, you know, as Cramps would say, the flesh and body individuals that we're, you know, studying or making theories about, and then two, of the people that I guess I've left behind, if you will. And so it's funny to me because I went, when I studied abroad in London, I was still at the point that I didn't know there was a negative connotation with Fox News. I just thought Fox News was all that there was. I didn't know that anything else existed. And my sociology professor there, she was Dutch and she self-identified as communist, and she was brilliant. And she like made kind of a joke about Fox News, and then all the Europeans started laughing, and I was like, it's a joke, I don't get it, I'm like totally missing the point here. And I think that experience kind of, for me, is the mocking there comes more out of the process of duping that happens with news sources like that. And it's not to say that there aren't liberal sources that don't do the same thing, because I think there definitely are. But I don't think that my dad, I don't make fun of my dad for watching it because I understand why he does. But I do hold a lot of resentment to like Bill O'Reilly and some of the other people on there, because there's very intentional alternative fact spreading going on. And so for me, I try to separate the people who are being swayed by those arguments because they sound familiar and they sound like they are in their own interest. I try to separate my engagement with them from my engagement with news sources such as like Fox News or something. And so that's kind of the way I approach it. I try to like keep those two things separate. But I struggle with this as well. So
actually, and you mentioned the flesh and body individuals, and kind of as a follow-up, how would you respond to those that might suggest is that you've taken the flesh and body individuals and their insights and then brought them into the academy and have removed them?
Correct. You know, my counter response would be I have trying to, well, first Steve Lambert, through his interviews with them, helped them give a showcase. But here, my aim was, and I tried to write it in an extremely accessible manner. Now granted, yes, the publisher is an academic publisher, but what I wanted to do was to help kind of disseminate this to a larger audience. Part of which is, yes, part of it is the academic audience, but to show the academic audience that in fact, you know, these everyday people, economists, have quite sophisticated, albeit complex and contradictory views of the economy. And so that was that part of it. But also because of social media, and as such, since we're being recorded here, and that's also part and parcel of the public pedagogy project, where now we have the means to be able to disseminate it much more widely and invite larger audiences beyond a very small academic one to really debate and engage with it, you know, on multiple social media pages and so forth.
Just a quick addition, perhaps. Just to agree with you. The economic arguments are quite sophisticated that some of the people articulate, right? So some of the arguments about social mobility and the lack thereof, some of the arguments about the bargaining power that a worker has in the presence of unemployment, some of the arguments about the experience with time and the way that people experience time and pressure, right? And I would actually venture to say that some of these arguments are more sophisticated than some of the dominant discourses of economics today, right? And to give you an idea of how, I want to say not sophisticated, the dominant mainstream economic discourses are, one of the main stories that economists tell about the Great Depression is that the Great Depression was really the Great Vacation. So in the 1920s and 1930s, rational individuals foresaw the post-war boom in the 1940s and 1950s, and they decided to take a vacation in the 1930s. Similarly, economists tell stories where they talk about the Great Recession using full employment models, where the only reason why you have a recession is because people choose, individuals choose to work less. Right? So, and we all have to deal with that sometimes, right? And we tend to valorize, like, you know, academic research, and at the same time, some of the people here, despite their contradictions, right, and there's a lot of contradictions here, manage to articulate these complex and sophisticated arguments that actually reflect their lived experiences and tell a good story about how they economy works. So that, I think, is...
Instead of trying to rationalize it after the fact?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
And I think when you read this book, I mean, the engagement with interviews and the interviews themselves, it's all very personal. Like, it doesn't feel, I've often, one of my critiques often, like when reading research, is that after collecting data, the researchers analyze it so objectively, and it seems it's kind of like a lab experiment, and this is not like that at all. It feels very, you feel as if you're just engaging in a conversation with these people and just trying to get to understand them at a deeper level, which I think is the power of it.
So what strikes me in what you said is actually, I was thinking about this question. It's how language is used to reframe an actual process, an actual social phenomenon that happens, right? So people don't lose their jobs, they choose not to work, or it's not a recession, it's a vacation of some sort, right? So my question to you is, I'm assuming in the book you also talk about the role language plays in enforcing and propagating certain ideas, ideologies, propaganda, right? And because you started from the question, or you started by stating most Americans do not favor capitalism, yet it's still around. So what is the mechanism, and what role does language play in propagating or keeping that mechanism alive?
Yeah, that's a great question. part of it is, as Panagiota was talking about, it's also not just language, but of course, how it's been materially instantiated, right? And so, I'm a kid from the Cold War era, and I remember, putting my hand over my heart, saying the Pledge of Allegiance during the 1960s and 70s at the height of the Cold War. And it was a very real thing that to question capitalism in any, well, first of all, you didn't even question capitalism, because to go there, that meant you were a dirty commie. Yeah, and then, get out of America. If you like this USSR so much, go move there. So I think that's a large part of it. The other part of it is that, it's kind of, as I outlined in the book, part of the discursive strands is that because of the, what's been called, this kind of ideological collocations of terms, so that capitalism has been so closely aligned or collocated with the word freedom, right? And this idea that to be free, we need to be in a capitalist society, because that means I could be the next Bill Gates, right? Or I can quit anytime I want and start my own business.
You can choose to not work,
right?
right?
I can choose not to work or whatever, yeah. And we see that of course, in Hollywood movies. We see that in Hollywood TV shows. So all of those images, representations are repeated, and so that is part of, obviously, the whole idea about that. But the other thing I would also say, though, is that there's a very interesting book that just came out. I just started reading it, by a political science scholar named James Martell, and the book's title is The Misinterpolated Subject. And so he's drawing upon this idea of Althusser's work, in which if we're actually being interpolated, right? So this idea that capitalist society is trying to interpolate all of us as capitalist subjects, willing subjects.
Sorry, what does that word mean?
Okay,
interpolate?
yes. So interpolation was Althusser's idea that how ideology works in terms of appealing to us. And so the way I explain it, it would be, and the way he explains it actually, is using the metaphor of you're walking down the street and two cops say, hey, you turn around, talking to me, you're hailed. You're interpolated as a subject that the cops are actually addressing. So in the same way that capitalism says to us, hey, you, if we turn around and say, yes, me, we're being hailed as slaves or subjects of capital. Okay? So part of the complication of that, though, is that where is the agency for us to say, hey, don't talk to me. Literally, don't talk to me. Or if the other hailing, such as he uses the example in the book of course, the Declaration of the Rights of Man, the Haitian revolutionaries, they were not the ones who that Declaration of the Rights of Man were intended. It was intended to, of course, the white upper class who were revolting against, right, monarchy. And yet the Haitian revolutionaries got a hold of this and said, hey, this is us. And it's like, and they showed up. So I think therein lies, I think, part of that idea of cultivating through public pedagogy how we can actually show up and say, well, freedom, but this is not what it looks like.
Actually, I've struggled in my own work. I wrote my dissertation on freedom in the neoliberal society. So I struggle, with this idea of freedom, how freedom works in capitalism, and it's a very well-crafted narrative and discourse. So if you read Milton Friedman's, for example, Free to Choose, which is the neoliberal manifesto, and you see how freedom is defined there. I mean, it's scary, but at the same time, it's appealing to people. I mean, people are made to feel like they're free. And the way this is done through language and discourse, I think it happens through different ways. One of them is naturalness. It's natural, we are free to choose. It's a natural, yeah, please.
Well, I'm sorry to interrupt. This is to put your point in the discussion of the replacement of Obamacare, Ryan kept on saying that we're giving people freedom, freedom to choose. It came up in my class today, and I said, yeah, his notion of freedom is freedom to choose a health plan with a deductible of $25,000 and you don't have health. That's not freedom.
Yeah, because it's freedom to choose what? Bourdieu has a really interesting idea. He says in order to be free to choose, you have to have an agenda of choice and a code of choice. So not only should you be able to have different options, real options, not imaginary options, but also you have to be able to navigate those options. And that means maybe you need an educational capital, cultural capital. So maybe these options are out there for you, but how are you going to reach them if you don't have the code to do that? So this is very important. Yes, there might be choices, but they're really no choice if you cannot access them. So, but this is a typical narrative of capitalism, this idea of choice. So one way this is done, I think, is through the naturalness of language, as I said earlier. Second is this neutrality of discourse. We use language just to express real things. There's nothing metaphysical about language. We name what we see in front of us. For example, markets. Markets are natural entities, right? And of course they are. Yeah, didn't you know that?
Until you get to derivatives.
Yeah. And another thing that I noticed, I mean, recently in Greece, but also here in the United States, is this whole idea of the anthropomorphism of the market. So when we talk about the markets, we give them human qualities. If you read the news, it's like, oh, the markets were in crisis today. We have to ask the markets. The markets are dancing today.
It's Marxist fetishism.
Yes. So it's really interesting, this human qualities. So suddenly the coal worker, right, identifies with this market because the market has flesh and bones and a soul, and it thinks and it dances and it's happy and it's sad.
And it cares about you.
And cares about
There's
you,
a lot
yes.
of
Yes.
conceptual metaphor of
or-
all kinds in there, yeah.
Or there's nothing you can do about it because the market is all powerful.
Of course, yeah.
And that's the part that really gets to me. And when Marx talks the importance that Marx talks about fetishism, commodity fetishism, is creating this monster which we then no longer control. But I'm thinking about how the wonderful opportunity of teaching at UMass Boston or any working class college. I went to City College in New York, and we have here, on the one hand, I'm struck when I teach my classes that I have students who get it right away, who because of their life experiences, if you touch on it, they see it very clearly, the contradictions between what's said and what's really out there. And then we have students who haven't had that experience yet, who, as you said, still think they're going to go out there and make $1 million, billion bucks, and they're going to rule the world. And it's that conflict, which could be a constructive conflict, if you tap into it.
This actually, I think that resonates with a point a friend of mine has made before. In dealing with students who come at it from the sympathetic perspective in capitalism and say, okay, so if we do need the freedom, if we do need the choice, well, nobody owns the Amazon. Nobody owns national parks. Obviously, these are grounds for opportunity. They're grounds for people to benefit. Invest in the now. These we have to improve efficiencies. How do you counter that? If they're trying to use their reasoning, the same reasoning to justify the value of capitalism.
Is this a question?
Maybe rhetorical. but I mean, how do you engage with that? If I'm going to use your argument against you to say this is why capitalism works, or this is why Does that make sense?
Yes. You know, part of the thing was that, and this is what Harry was referring to, that and it was very tricky for me because, and as Laura referred to it as well, which I'm glad to hear that Laura thought I did it okay, but I did not want to, okay, so basically it was like, all right, so if we're talking about capitalism, as the economist Richard Wolff says, we can't assume that everyone's going to be talking about what they mean by the same thing.
Yeah.
So that's what I started to do right in the first few pages of the book, as Panagiota said, it's like, what is capitalism? And then I used the definition outlined in the Marxian tradition, which was to actually say, well, this is exactly why we characterize the system as capitalist, because of this, the way it's, the surplus labor that we produce is appropriated and distributed and so on. But by doing that, I was able then to kind of engage with what you just kind of said, where people would make the argument about, well, you know, well, look at all the benefits that capitalism has brought us. Do you really want to be in a country, and you know, as I've shown in my talk before, that guy, you know, a country like North Korea. You know, I have not been in North Korea, and actually a colleague in the field has either been to North Korea or something, and there's kind of conflicting research. I don't know. But, you know, just in terms of, like, if the Cold War images from the Soviet Union and again back, you know, people standing in long lines waiting for food, you know, here we have this whole abundance, you know, society. That argument in terms of, like, this is what capitalism has brought us, the counter-argument was like, no, this is what we have produced. This is what we have actually made, but yet none of it is ours.
And then okay.
Right, so.
Not to mention that even, you know, here there are long lines in soup kitchens or outside clinics, you know, for drug users. So, you know, it's not...
The contexts aren't necessarily incompatible.
And it's abundance for the few and really poverty for the many. And I think what you showed, the graph that you shared with us, shows exactly that.
When I was in Cuba last summer, you see a lot of juggling of these mindsets, and a lot of folks, you know, the brain surgeon turned taxi driver who says, you know, this is the way I can advance in society, you know, who is sympathetic to and understands the context in which they have developed, but now kind of with this filtering in of neoliberalism has embraced their own kind of like you know, pursuit of the tourist economy as a means of social mobility. I guess I'm just thinking out loud here, but again, you know, that's the, where do we reconcile? Where do you know what I mean? Like you said, they're all contradictory and they're opposing, and they're also maintained simultaneously and synchronously. Like how, if I guess we're coming at it from a sense of persuasiveness, like Laura mentioned, we're trying to persuade. What exactly are we trying to persuade?
Well, so coming at it from like the identity perspective, I think that, you know, there is no reconciliation. There is no unitary, like, one, this is it, this is the answer. And I think that whether it's language or the economy or what we represent as ourselves, it's going to be ever-changing and always in motion. And like you said, multiple will exist at one time and they will be in conflict with each other. And so I don't know if it's so much, I see in myself how, you know, when I go home, I immediately become like really conservative. And when I'm here, I'm really, like, it's just totally opposite. But it's so easy for that. I still get very swayed by conservative arguments sometimes, where I'll see something and I'm like, oh yeah, that definitely makes sense. And then I'm like, no, what am I thinking? This is not. And I like try to think about it more critically. But at the same time, it also, the fact that I am open to it in that way, kind of, it gives me that like perspective of understanding, and then it also makes it easier for me to engage in those conversations because I'm not so, you know, earnestly opposed to anything that might come from like end-all evil conservative side, and so like with the fact that those two very different, sort of ideologies can exist within me at the same time. It's like, I don't necessarily need to reconcile with them. I just have to acknowledge that they're both going to be existing, and depending on my social positioning, where I am, and we were just reading about being subject to different relationships and subject of different relationships, and so like depending on like my power in that situation too, like when I'm home, I'm very powerless because I look at my parents as being, I have to give them a lot of respect, and they know a lot more than I do, and so when they say something, I'm like, so I'm wrong. And then, when I return to my very safe haven of my roommates who are very like-minded and think the same way I do and support me in the ways that I think and the ways that I explore knowledge, I start thinking about it more, and I'm like, why didn't I say this response, or why didn't I challenge that at all, or why didn't? And it's just because my power changes so totally. So I think a brain surgeon can also be a taxi driver, and that's okay. And that's just coming more from the idea of letting them represent themselves as they see themselves.
Yeah. So this is just kind of a comment, I guess. So my view of capitalism was sort of like capitalism is based off of this false idea of meritocracy, where if you work really hard, you'll be able to succeed, right? Well, the problem with capitalism, they say, okay, with meritocracy, everyone has an equal chance to succeed. The problem with that is that capitalism may be considered equal, but it's not equitable, right? It's not equitable. Not everyone has a fair chance, because nowadays, privilege seems to be almost inherited. So I really liked the comparison of kind of this triangle and, the top 1%. And I liked how, Dr. Chun, I forget who you compared, but you compared surplus value with being a form of feudalism, or the capitalistic system of being a form of feudalism. How everyone kind of works for, a certain amount during the week, and how that wealth goes to the top, and they only get to save a small percent, right?
What I had said in the lecture in February was that actually under feudalism it was much more distinct under the corvée for the peasants, that it was clearly marked off. So when the lord of the estate would say, 3 days of the week you work for me, 3 days you work for yourself. So it was quite clear what those days were. Under capitalism, the distinction is much more muddied. So as I talked about it, if you're working like the proverbial 9 to 5 shift, right? Those 8 hours, you're not, just only a few of those hours you're just earning back your actual pay, and then the rest that you're all of that is going into the owner. So, but that's not clear cut. It's not like, 10:45, now I'm working for the man, so to speak. It's
your productivity doesn't match your wage.
Sure. I'm sorry.
Economist. And I could have misinterpreted that. So.
I was teaching Marx in History of Thought, right? And one of the questions that people say is like, oh, but you get paid for every hour that you work. How are you exploited, right? So the back of the envelope calculation, right? Back of the envelope, right? So don't, I guess I'm videotaped. It's
we're not going to use
Foley 1986 does this in his book, Duncan Foley, right? So basically he says the following thing. How much value does the average worker produce every hour? Right? Let's compare that to what the average worker gets every hour. So the way that Foley does that is to divide the American GDP, which is approximately $17 trillion, by 150 million workers, right, who work in the US. And you multiply the 150 million to 2,000 hours, which is 40 times 50. So if you work an average of 40 hours a week for 50 hours, for 50 weeks a year, that gives you the 2,000. Now, if you do this calculation, the product per hour is $57. $57. So the way that I actually do this in the class, I say, you guys are average workers, right? It's like, you make $57? I don't make $57. Do you know anybody who makes $57? So that's, again, back of the envelope, right? So it's not completely consistent with Marx's discussion of surplus, because you have to make some subtractions there, take some sectors
It's
out.
convenient for conceptual.
But you know, I think it drives home this argument of exploitation, right? Like you don't quite get back what you put in the system, right? The value that you add is not what you get back, right? If that were the case, you know, where would profits come from? That's basically the argument.
Right. Oh, sorry.
No, go ahead.
Well, I think the problem that I see is that all this, the wealth distribution, all the wealth is heading to the top, right? The 1%. The rich are getting richer, the poor are getting poorer, and with this, we're creating this two-tier society, right? I guess, like, my confusion with this is that, okay, well, if the 1% control, you know, the most amount of hold the most amount of power, how can we change a capitalistic system when the top 1% is in control? Can we really change the capitalistic system?
We're doing a bang-up job here.
I don't know, I guess
There's how many of us?
My response to that would be that change has never come from the people who are in power.
Yeah.
That's kind of the whole idea of a revolution. And,
So speaking, where is that revolution?
Wow.
Maureen hasn't answered me.
No, not an answer. I was going to link the discussion to my question about if we could go back to public pedagogies. Because the way, I mean, I confess I don't really know how to define public pedagogies, but Christian, you seem to say that it was the result of some action that brings transformation. And my question is, how would you see the action happening in the classroom? Or do public pedagogies necessarily involve action outside the classroom?
Yeah.
And also, how could you use your book, I mean this book with all these testimonies and this contradiction, how could you use it as a tool?
Right.
Because I feel that it's very inspiring.
Oh, thank you, Greg. All right, well, I'll try to link actually both Jamie and Corinne's questions together. So, you know, briefly, public pedagogy has come out of the whole tradition of critical pedagogy. And so, as you just mentioned, yes, public pedagogy is this idea of what the learning that takes place outside the classroom, right? And so whether it's in public spaces or online, that's also considered the provinces of public pedagogy, right? You know, this idea that, you know, if this... It's interesting when we're in a historical moment where we feel that we see institutions to be permanent forever. In fact, they never have, right? Things change sometimes overnight, sometimes they take a long time. And so, you know, if we look at the whole long arc of history, you know, we see how these changes have suddenly arisen, right? But part of it, a lot of it has to do with on the ground through hard work, right, with people. And so kind of going back to your question, you know, what I'm hoping is that this would just be my very small contribution to a larger collective project in which, you know, we get more and more people, whether it's through at first online or other social media, to start talking more about this, which has already happened. We've seen what we saw in 2011 with the Occupy movement. Now, you know, people criticized, there were several people on the left that criticized the Occupy movement because of the lack of organization. I think that was an unfair critique because there has not been any organized movement on the left for quite some time, and that was done strategically by the powers that be, right, since the 70s and 80s, thanks to administrations of Ronald Reagan and so forth that clamped down on unions. However, that was a start, and so I think also what we saw last year, the enthusiasm for the candidacy of Senator Sanders also indexed this. So what we need to do, though, going forward is to, as I would hope, using just public pedagogy as just one tool, but to kind of use it as a way to engage the everyday people that we might think of, oh, these Fox viewers, who are in fact actually, you know, against capitalism, although they frame it in different ways. And I'm not going to romanticize it, but part of the demographic of the Tea Party was because they knew the system was no longer working for them. They just blamed it on other agents, such as President Obama or the government, rather than the economic system itself.
And that's kind of the position that's been taken now with what is the resist, or I forget the indivisible. The indivisible. Are you familiar with that?
Radio show?
The indivisible is, there is a radio show. Or
is that what you were referring to?
Indivisible is a document created by folks who, and I don't want to mischaracterize their involvement, but they are folks who have worked in campaigns, and they saw what the Tea Party did and what was effective, and that it was a resistance. You know, they weren't trying to propose new policies. They weren't trying to bring about changes. They were just stop it. Stop it, stop it, stop it. And now, where we are in our current political climate, we're in the same situation where we can't propose an alternative. We just have to resist.
Well, except there's like our revolution, which is they are presenting alternatives.
And I mean, with infighting and with structural issues as well, and you know, and a lot of critiques of
I
co-opting.
guess the issue is how to unify all this, because right
Because,
now
yeah,
it
'cause
feels like the struggle is fragmented. And you know what's happening when the struggle is fragmented? Trump gets elected.
Exactly.
Neo-Nazi parties get elected. Fascist parties get elected just because they feel this void everywhere. So the worries and the struggles of the people are met by these extreme right and fascist parties.
So, but then you can't vacillate to the other side too. You know, where your I Heart Huckabee's argument. So, like when we go to full inclusion mode or full snowflake mode, you know what I mean?
Full
When we
inclusion,
lose
specific political agenda.
exactly,
Not
and that's the
everybody is
issue.
welcome.
We lose. So, you know, we're in this vacillating point where you go from where you need an exact, specific agenda, a focused agenda, rather than feel good snowflakey everything. You know.
I don't think anyone here would be advocating feel good snowflakey. But you know, just quickly, and again, Harry would know. You know, people like Richard Wolff. Another shout out to Richard Wolff, the economist, public intellectual. But you know, what he talks about in his project, Democracy at Work, it is really about that. It's where, okay, where do we spend most of our lives is at the workplace, right? And as Harry was talking about, but we think we live in a democracy, democratic society, but we spend most of our lives in a workplace which is decidedly non-democratic, including, and I know I'm being recorded, including the university.
We'll cut that out.
It's all relative.
So I think if with the focus here about organizing at the workplace to make our workplaces truly democratic, you know, that is definitely one start. I don't have the answers to everything, of course, but that would be, you know. Yes.
Can I get back to the issue of public pedagogy?
Sure.
I want to say that what Harry teaches, when he teaches the course on Marxism,
Yeah.
that's public pedagogy.
Absolutely.
When he takes, you know, Marx is, I think one of his great contributions is this notion, and that's why he organized his writing in that way, is that we suffer from a veil of superficiality, and it requires individuals to penetrate that, to expose, in fact, that superficiality, that surface. And when you do it in the class, it's amazing how the students respond.
Yes.
I know that you do that in your class. And when I say in my class, you know, they Apple and it's making all this profits and stuff. And I say, where do you think they make this profit? Oh, you know, why? They put out just such a wonderful thing. It's the profit is the No, they're making the profits on those workers in Foxconn in China who are making, 10 cents an hour. Well, all of a sudden, bang, something goes off in their heads. And they don't see the world the same way anymore. And I'm always amazed that the receptivity here We teach a course in Marxism, it's always over-enrolled.
And we discussed it for next semester because of the budget cuts. I'm going to say this over here. Right? These are the courses that are getting cancelled. If you look on the Weiser, it's no longer offered. So
where's the
so
issue?
these are the courses, like just to give a little bit of more to talk about that, like the critical perspectives are the ones that get cancelled when, you know, we lost ecological economics, we lost Marxian economics, and we lost economics of social welfare.
What are you doing about it?
Something I hope. I don't know, like,
I didn't know that.
yeah, no Weiser. It's no longer offered.
Maybe you should
We're starting a campaign, there's a campaign.
Maybe we should we should teach it anyway.
We shouldn't end on that negative.
No, on a positive note.
Okay, end on a positive.
I can't actually.
I'll give you a positive note.
Okay.
I think this could be a global project. I would ask that question in countries in Europe, in Eastern Europe. I lived until my early 20s in Romania, and I know the evolution of my own country coming out of extreme communism, transitioning into capitalism, and I know how my parents' generation would answer the question, is capitalism working for you? And it'd be interesting to see how once you've experienced the byproducts of Marxism in their extreme variety, you do choose capitalism because of all those things that it symbolizes, freedom and whatnot, right? But I think it'd be interesting to go to other countries and ask that question and analyze the answers of people.
Yeah.
So good luck with that.
Yeah, thank you. I'll try to get a grant from the Bill Gates Foundation.
So thank you so much
Thank you.
for coming.
If you're interested, the Routledge sent me flyers with a 20% discount to speak about capitalism, commodity.
And about selling your labor.
This one? This one, too.
Very good. Thank you.
That's this one right here.
The book